Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. My name is Joshua Sijuwade, and I want to first thank all of the organizers of this conference. It's a great conference, and I'm really privileged to be part of it. Now, the title of my presentation is A Sketch of a Fundamental Explanation. Now, according to Richard Swinburne, Theism, the claim that there is a God, provides a true explanation for the existence of the universe and its features. Theism is thus taken by Swinburne and others to be the ultimate explanation for there being a universe, and it being conformed to simple natural laws that lead to the evolution of conscious and morally aware human agents. In this talk, I seek to assess the extent to which theism can also provide a true fundamental explanation for the existence of certain entities within the layered structure of reality. More precisely, I assume the cogency of Swinburne's explanatory framework and seek to resituate it within a new philosophical context, that of the field of contemporary metaphysics, which will enable me to develop a true fundamental explanation for the existence of the non-fundamental entities that fill up the various levels of the layered structure of reality. And thus, given the truth of this type of explanation, we will have one more good reason to believe in the existence of God. So section 1 of my talk is titled Explanatory Framework. In contemporary metaphysics, the nature of a metaphysical explanation is a hotly contested issue. However, minimal understanding of a true metaphysical explanation is that of it involving entities and a non-causal explanatory connection, a law of metaphysics, which is a counterfactual supporting generalization about what grounds what, which then accounts for the nature and or existence of one entity with reference to another entity that the former non-causally and synchronically depends upon. Once these factors are in place, we have a true metaphysical explanation for the nature and or existence of a given entity at a specific time. In utilizing Swinburne's explanatory framework within a metaphysical context, we can see that a metaphysical explanation can come in three different forms: a partial metaphysical explanation, a full metaphysical explanation, and a complete metaphysical explanation. Focusing on the latter two, a full metaphysical explanation is a form of explanation that includes a set of factors, an entity, and a law of metaphysics that another entity is fully, non-causally, and synchronically dependent upon. Whereas a complete metaphysical explanation is a special form of a full metaphysical explanation that includes a set of factors, an entity, and a law of metaphysics that another entity is fully, non-causally, and synchronically dependent upon, and which the existence of these factors is not dependent upon another contemporaneously existing entity. In other words, the existence of the latter entity is the fundamental reason for the former entity existing. So, given the importance of the notion of fundamentality for this form of explanation, we can now reterm a complete metaphysical explanation a fundamental explanation. And so, taking all of this into account, these are the different kinds and forms of explanation that are available within a metaphysical context. And so, the important question to be faced now then is, what are the justificatory grounds for one believing that they have acquired a true fundamental explanation for the existence of a given entity? The justificatory grounds on which an explanation is judged to be a correct terminus in explanation, that is, how probable it is that this explanation is a fundamental explanation of the existence of a particular entity, centers on the extent to which it fulfills the following inductive criteria. 1, the criterion of predictive power; 2, the criterion of background knowledge; 3, the criterion of scope; and 4, the criterion of simplicity. For 1, the criterion of predictive power, this criterion assesses whether or not the postulated explanation predicts the existence of a given entity, when otherwise its entity would not be expected to have existed. For 2, the criterion of background knowledge, this criterion assesses whether the entities invoked by the explanation are similar to those entities that are taken to exist within other neighboring fields. For 3, the criterion of scope, this criterion assesses how much the postulated explanation seeks to explain. Generally, an explanation that seeks to explain more data is less probably true than one that is more restricted in its explanatory range. However, as we are assessing fundamental explanations, which are of the widest scope, this criterion will drop out of our analysis. For 4, the criterion of simplicity, This criterion assesses, specifically within a metaphysical context, whether the postulated explanation is quantitatively and qualitatively simple. That is, it postulates, amongst other things, the fewest fundamental entities, the fewest properties of fundamental entities, the fewest kinds of fundamental entities, and the fewest kinds of fundamental properties. So if an explanation posits the existence of some new particular fundamental object or properties, it is required by the criterion of simplicity that it should postulate as few as possible, and it should postulate no more than those that are needed to explain the observational data. So this is the inductive criteria that provide the justificatory ground for holding to the probable truth of a particular metaphysical explanation, where we seek the simplest explanation fitting with our background knowledge, which leads us to expect the existence of certain entities when otherwise they would not be expected to have existed. And the fulfillment of these criteria is the grounds for one determining the stopping point for a purported fundamental explanation. That is, one is to move beyond the data and the currently available explanations of it only if there's a possibility of a greater fulfillment of the inductive criteria. And that will be so if there is a potential explanation that is simpler and or explains the data better while still fitting with background knowledge. Thus, in regards to theism and whether it can serve as a fundamental explanation of a certain set of metaphysical data, one will need to establish whether theism, relative to the data, sufficiently meets the inductive criteria. And if it does, given the nature that God is taken to have, he must serve as a fundamental explanation of this data. In short, once we establish that theism is probably true, that is, it's a simplest explanation fitting with our background knowledge that led us to expect the data when otherwise it would not be expected, then one has reached a terminus in explanation. So the question that is now presented to us is, what is the nature of the particular phenomenon that we are seeking a fundamental explanation of? In other words, what is our explanatory target, and how does theism and any other potential explanation seek to explain it? Section 2 of my talk is titled Explanatory Target. It's an evident fact of reality that a variety of different things exist, ordered from the very large things, for example, planets, stars, and galaxies, passing through the more medium-sized things, such as flamingos, humans, and buildings, to the very small things, such as quarks, protons, and neutrons. Some of these types of things are taken to be dependent entities that are in some sense less important than some other things within this structure. Flamingos, for example, appear to depend upon the existence of planets and stars, and all would agree, though flamingos are important as a species, without our planet and star existing in the here and now, flamingos will also not exist in the here and now, but not vice versa. Nonetheless, it is quite clear to most metaphysicians that the variety of content that makes up our reality is arranged into layers or a hierarchy of levels. Galaxies reside at the top level and thus are at a higher level than flamingos that reside at the middle level, which are themselves in turn at a higher level than quarks that reside at the bottom level of this structure. Or at a more scientific or categorical level, economics resides at the top level and is thus at a higher level than biology, which resides at the middle level, and thus itself in turn is at a higher level than physics, which resides at the bottom level of this specific structure. Reality is thus multi-layered with an increasing level of importance as you descend down its levels, or as some say, as you ascend higher up its levels. So given this layered view of reality, an important question that needs to be answered is, what makes a certain phenomenon higher or lower, and thus less important or more important than another? A plausible answer to this question is that of each of the phenomena being connected and ordered by a relation of dependence and determination, which, following Karen Bennett, we can construe as a building relation of grounding. Grounding is a non-causal, irreflexive, asymmetrical, and transitive ordering relation. And so this relation of grounding provides a basis for this hierarchical structure, and we can slot it seamlessly into our scheme. So focusing now on the scientific classificatory scheme, according to this metaphysical picture termed metaphysical foundationalism, some phenomenon of economics, goods and services, is grounded by some phenomenon of biology, humans, which is grounded by some phenomenon of chemistry, chemicals, which is grounded by some phenomenon of physics, quarks. And so, given this hierarchical scheme, some metaphysicians take the categories residing within the lower levels of this structure, for example, physics, to be more fundamental than those residing within the high levels, for example, biology and economics, with an explanation of the entities that exist in the high levels ultimately terminating the existence of an absolutely fundamental entity or entities that exist within the lower levels. These absolutely fundamental entities are fundamental in the sense of themselves being ungrounded and them being the ground of everything else. And so we can illustrate this metaphysical picture as such. This is the content and structure of reality, which we can see with economics and psychology, biology, chemistry, and physics playing a part within this structure. And there is a building relation of grounding, which is linking them all together. And at the bottom of that structure, you see the entities within the physics category being absolutely fundamental. And all the other ones above it are taken to be non-fundamental entities. So, as I said, this is the content and structure of reality. However, one can indeed ask, why must we posit the existence of an absolutely fundamental entity that serves the role of being a terminus of explanation in this structure? Well, in answer to this, why we must make this postulation of the existence of an entity or entities of this kind is because despite having an explanation for each of the entities along the chain that we saw by reference to the more fundamental entities are below them, what we do not have, as Ricky Bliss has noted in a similar context, is that of an explanation for why there are any non-fundamental entities whatsoever. Thus, we can take our explanatory target to be that of providing an explanation for their existing non-fundamental entities rather than none at all. And this target, the fact that there are any non-fundamental entities whatsoever, is in need of an explanation that is itself inexplicable and thus is not a dependent link within the explanatory chain of the hierarchical structure of reality. In other words, this explanatory target captures certain phenomena whose existence require a further, more fundamental explanation, an explanation provided by the existence of an absolutely fundamental entity or entities. So given our framework and our exposition of our explanatory target, it will be important to now turn our attention to unpacking and assessing the viable candidates for a fundamental explanation. So, section 3 of my talk is titled Explanatory Analysis. In contemporary metaphysics, 3 candidates for a fundamental explanation for our explanatory target present themselves: theism, priority monism, and priority pluralism. We can now firstly turn our attention towards understanding the nature of theism and then proceed on to the other 2 candidate fundamental explanations. So, theism. The theistic explanation centers around the simple claim that there is a God. This claim is a personal metaphysical explanation. It seeks to provide an explanation that invokes the powers, beliefs, and intentions of a personal agent. And it's a claim that is at the heart of the major theistic world religions, such as Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Sikhism. Now, there are various ways to construe this particular claim. However, the specific way that it will be construed here is that of there being a God defined as a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope. And this specific rendering of theism centers around this notion of a trope, this notion of a powerful module trope, which has been introduced and defended by various trope theorists such as D.C. Williams, Keith Campbell, Anna Sophia Morin, George Molnar, and many others. Unfortunately, there is not enough time to unpack the nature of a powerful module trope. However, what we can say is that a powerful module trope is a non-composite, primitively qualitative, and irreducible entity that functions as a property in a stretched sense. More precisely, it's a singly charactered particular object that is identical to the character that it grounds, i.e., it is self-exemplifying. And so, for example, a hotness trope is a particular object, a property in a stretched sense, that is identical, however, to its nature, heat, and it fulfills the role of grounding the heat of the entity that it constitutes, such as that of a stove. And so a powerful module trope, as conceptualized by trope theories, is not something that is a causally inert property, but is an object that has powers in the sense that it has a disposition or ability to behave in certain ways in certain circumstances, such as that of a hotness trope causing a burn mark on an individual's hand after they've touched a certain stove. And so, taking this concept of a powerful module trope into account and applying it within a theistic context, we can posit that God is first a module trope in the sense that he's an entity that is primitively qualitative and irreducible. He's a singly charactered particular object, a property in a stretched sense. Furthermore, as a module trope, God is powerful in the sense that he has a disposition or ability to behave in certain ways in certain circumstances. And this disposition or ability, however, is without any of the limitations that certain other powerful module tropes may have. Thus, more precisely, God will have an unlimited disposition or ability to behave in certain ways in any logically possible circumstance. In short, God is an unlimited powerful trope, which is simply to say that he's an omnipotence trope, which we can see in front of us. So through those images, you can see God is identical to an omnipotence module trope. Now, as an omnipotence trope, God is a personal entity, a personal module trope, due to the fact that for him to exercise his omnipotence, he must be an entity that has a rich form of consciousness that enables him to perform a range of actions that are solely limited by logic. Furthermore, given his omnipotence, God will be an entity that is first unlimited in knowledge. He knows of all propositions that they are true. Second, unlimited in presence. He's cognizant of and causally active at every point of space. Third, he will be unlimited in freedom. He's free from any non-rational influence determining the choices that he makes. And fourth, he'll be unlimited in goodness. He always performs the best action or kind of action if there is one, and he performs many good actions and no bad actions. And so these are the attributes of God: omniscience, omnipresence, perfect freedom, perfect goodness, that are derivable from the supposition that God is an omnipotence trope. However, in construing God as an omnipotence trope, we can also take him to be metaphysically simple, given the fact that a trope, a module trope, is a non-composite and irreducible entity. And so in construing God in this particular way, we can see that the derivable attributes of God are in fact related to him by relation of numerical identity. More specifically, according to the notion of metaphysical simplicity, and in line with the conception of him as a trope, God is non-composite and irreducible in the sense of him lacking proper parts, where a proper part is a portion of an entity that is numerically distinct from it. Thus, by taking God to be metaphysically simple, there is no portion of God that is numerically distinct from him. God is a being who intrinsically within himself does not have any division or ontological composition. Any intrinsic property that's attributable to God is thus numerically identical to him. And so, as we can see in the other image in front of us, all of those derivable attributes of God, or the attributes that he has, are numerically identical to him. And so theism thus postulates the existence of one metaphysically simple and personal module trope, God, who has a single character of omnipotence and is numerically identical to each of the attributes of divinity that are rightly predicated of him. And so we can now turn our attention to fleshing out the nature of the alternative candidate fundamental explanations of priority monism and priority pluralism. Now, in the field of fundamental mereology, Jonathan Schaeffer has proposed a distinction between the notions of priority monism and priority pluralism. At a basic level, the priority monist holds to the whole being prior to its parts. More specifically, priority monism takes the whole identified as the cosmos to be a single fundamental concrete object that is ontologically prior to all other actual concrete material objects, which are taken then to be its proper parts. And so, importantly, the nature of the cosmos within this framework is identified as a general relativistic space-time manifold. And so material objects, the proper parts of the cosmos, are identified as regions of space-time. Thus, the space-time manifold that is the cosmos is a single substance that instantiates properties directly, that is, without any mediation of material objects. And so what we have in this framework is that the properties of material objects are actually pinned down onto the spatio-temporal substance. The cosmos thus possesses proper parts identified as space-time regions instantiating properties that then it is itself more fundamental than. And then, so what we have is this priority monist sort of position. And then we have, in contrast to this, the priority pluralist position, which holds to the parts of a whole being prior to it. And thus it takes there to be more than one fundamental entity in the layered structure of reality. Specifically, this position of priority pluralism is a conjunction of the numerical thesis concerning how many fundamental entities there are, there being at least two fundamental entities, and the partialistic thesis that the cosmos is itself non-fundamental. And so a specific form of priority pluralism is that of atomism, the view in which all derivative entities, including the cosmos, are grounded in a collection of mereological atoms, which, following Peter Simons, can also be conceptualized as a collection of individual and indivisible module tropes. And so the fundamental layer of reality is thus an indivisible collection of module tropes that support the existence of other non-fundamental entities. And so for priority monism, what we have is the picture of there being one and only one fundamental entity, the whole cosmos, which is prior to its proper parts, which are all the other existing concrete entities. And then what we also have, on the other hand, is the position of priority pluralism, which is the view that there are many fundamental entities, each of which is a proper part of the cosmos and is identified as a collection of mereological atoms or unextended, indivisible module tropes. And so we can sort of illustrate this position that's captured by these two positions as such. And so you have the same sort of framework here, but they are directed in different ways, the cosmos being at the top and then building everything below it. And then with the priority pluralism, you have the mereological atoms, these tropes, being sort of the bottom level of everything and then building everything up from that. And so this is the view of a materialistic and physicalist view that someone could hold to of the cosmos. You can take these sort of positions and they are exhaustive and exclusive positions that one must take. Either the cosmos is more fundamental than everything else, or the mereological atoms are more fundamental than everything else. And so either one of these things are to be taken as the absolutely fundamental entities. And so taking all of these things into account, these are the three candidate fundamental explanations of our explanatory target. We have theism, priority monism, and priority pluralism. And so to determine which of these options is to be deemed as the fundamental explanation and terminus in explanation for the existence of the various fundamental entities within the layered structure of reality, we must assess and compare the manner in which these explanations fulfill our inductive criteria. And so this assessment will now be done by focusing first on theism and then turning our attention to priority monism and priority pluralism. So theism has, firstly, for criterion one, predictive power to the extent to which we can attribute to God an intention to bring about the existence of non-fundamental entities. Now, plausibly, it is the best kind of action for God to bring about the existence of non-fundamental entities, given the unique goodness of this action. Specifically, the performance of this action is a unique good due to the holding of the diffusiveness principle, which is that of goodness necessarily being diffusive of itself. And so at a general level, according to the diffusiveness principle, goodness requires something other than itself as a manifestation of itself. Hence, a good being will inevitably bring about other good things. Thus, as it's better to exist than not to exist, that is, existence is a good thing, God, as Norman Kretzmann has written, necessarily, through with the freedom associated with the counterfactual choice that he has, wills the being of something other than himself. That is, as perfect goodness is an essential property of God and self-diffusiveness is essential to goodness itself, the existence of other entities outside of God will be an inevitable consequence of God's nature. And so, restating this within our metaphysical context, God, who is a perfectly good being, must diffuse his goodness by grounding the existence of all other things outside of himself. The existence of other non-fundamental entities, i.e., dependent or grounded entities, will thus be the necessary result of God's intention to produce good things. Thus, God's action of grounding the existence of non-fundamental entities is a product of his nature that stems from him necessarily, yet willfully, spreading his goodness in this creative act. Therefore, as God's perfectly good intentions are always realized, if there is a God, we can expect with a level of certainty that there will also be non-fundamental entities that exist alongside him. Theism thus fulfills criterion 1 to a level of certainty. And so then, corresponding to this, we can also see that the central claim provided by theism, that there is a God, a metaphysically simple omnipotence trope, fits with our background knowledge as well, as it posits the existence of a certain type of entity, a trope, that is at the foundation of contemporary metaphysics. Specifically, tropes are a standard feature of most current-day ontologies, where influential metaphysicians such as D.C. Williams, Keith Campbell, Jonathan Schaeffer, Peter Simons, Anna Sophia Morin, Douglas Erin, Chris McDaniel, and Michael Lau all have utilized the concept of a trope within their ontological system. Moreover, tropes do not only feature in the ontological system of various metaphysicians, but are also plausible options for dealing with various issues within contemporary philosophy. That is, tropes, amongst other and many other things that they can do, find their use in the metaphysics of properties by providing a means for one to affirm a form of realism, and also in the metaphysics of persistence and identity by providing a basis for the notions of endurance and perdurance, and in the philosophy of physics by providing a philosophical basis for quantum theory and the standard model of elementary particles. Tropes are thus the staple of metaphysical theorizing, and therefore the postulation of the existence of God, identified as a trope, meshes well with other theories from the neighboring fields within contemporary metaphysics. Theism thus fulfills criterion 2 to a significant level. Furthermore, and this is focusing on criterion 4, theism is also very simple explanation, or in fact, it's the simplest possible personal fundamental explanation, as it explains the various phenomena of reality in terms of the powerful action of one personal entity, God, rather than many personal entities. And thus, it is an explanation that is quantitatively simple. It's simpler than any other polytheistic-based personal explanation. However, theism is not only quantitatively simple, but it's also qualitatively simple, in the sense that it postulates the existence of the simplest kind of personal entity. That is, as God is metaphysically simple and thus lacks proper parts, God is the fewest number and kinds of properties possible, 0. As instead of possessing properties, each attribution made of God is numerically identical to him. God's attributes are just God himself. There is thus no further explanation that is needed to be provided for why God has the properties that he does, as he does not have any properties. And so what we can say is that God literally has zero properties within this view. And furthermore, as theism identifies God as a trope of a modular kind, it posits the existence of an entity of the fewest number of kinds, one. As assuming the correctness of classical trope theory, tropes allow one to affirm the existence of one ontological kind or category, trope, with the other categories of substance and universals being denied. Thus, by theism positing the existence of God, one only has to be committed to the existence of one ontological kind or category. And thus, this type of fundamental explanation allows one to continue to have a very parsimonious ontology. And so theism is thus quantitatively and qualitatively simple. It's the simplest possible type of explanation, as it postulates the fewest number and kinds of entities, one, with the fewest number and kinds of properties, zero. Theism thus fulfills criterion 4 as well. Therefore, within our context of analysis, theism thus fulfills all of the relevant components of our inductive criteria. And so the question now is, do the other possible alternative fundamental explanations of priority monism and priority pluralism do this as well? And so for priority monism, there is a postulation made concerning the existence of a fundamental entity, the cosmos, which is the mereological fusion of all other existing material objects. This entity is identified as a space-time manifold, with all other existing material objects being identified as space-time regions that are dependent proper parts of the cosmos. Whereas for priority pluralism, there's a postulation made concerning the existence of a collection of mereological atoms that make up the larger entities, and thus ultimately the cosmos, with these mereological atoms being the proper parts of all of the existing concrete objects. And so what we have then for priority monism is that there is thus this postulation the existence of one fundamental entity. And for priority pluralism, there is a postulation of many fundamental entities. And so in regard to the predictive power of both explanations, it is quite clear that this would be significantly high due to the fact that the existence of non-fundamental entities is entailed by the existence of the cosmos, as posited by priority monism. And also, it is entailed by the collection of mereological atoms as posited by priority pluralism. As what we can see is that inbuilt into the concept of the cosmos within priority monism is the fact that all other existing concrete objects are proper parts of the cosmos. And so we can then say with a level of certainty that if the single fundamental cosmos exists, then the various non-fundamental entities, its space-time regions and proper parts, will exist as well. And then likewise, it's also inbuilt into the priority monism framework that the collection of mereological atoms are the only fundamental entities. And thus all other existing concrete objects are non-fundamental entities that are composed of these various atoms. The non-fundamental entities are decomposable into these various atoms. And thus, we can also expect with a level of certainty that if the many fundamental mereological atoms exist, then the various non-fundamental entities will exist as well. And so both of these explanations thus fulfill criterion 1 very well. Furthermore, it's quite clear that priority monism and priority pluralism fit well with our background knowledge, given that the postulation of the cosmos for the former and the mereological atoms for the latter does not seem to conflict with anything within the fields of contemporary metaphysics. Rather, neighboring fields in and outside of metaphysics, such as contemporary physics, seems to take the existence of the cosmos as a given starting point for analysis. And they are also open to a sense of the possible existence of tropes, as I explained previously. And so criterion 2 is clearly fulfilled to a sufficient level by these two explanations as well. Thus, the question now is, do these two explanations then meet the final criterion, the criterion of simplicity? Now, the answer to this is quite clearly no. as priority monism is quantitatively simple, but fails to be qualitatively simple. And priority pluralism is qualitatively simple, but fails to be quantitatively simple. That is, on the one hand, priority monism postulates the existence of one fundamental concrete object, the cosmos, and thus postulates the existence of the fewest number of entities, one. Yet it does not postulate the fewest kinds of entities or the fewest number or kinds of properties. That is, for the former, it fails to do this by assuming a two-category ontology, substance and attribute/tropes, where the cosmos is the one fundamental substance that instantiates various universals or is constituted by various tropes. Therefore, if one is thus to affirm the veracity of priority monism, then one must also affirm the veracity of this type of ontology. And therefore, one will be saddled with the issues that are present within this type of ontology, such as Bradley's regress. Moreover, for the latter, as the cosmos is the space-time manifold that has material objects as proper parts, and it has this in the form of it's being sort of constituted in a way by space-time regions, the properties of these material objects are then pinned onto the cosmos itself. The cosmos thus instantiates a near infinite number of properties, that of its proper parts. And so the cosmos, as construed in this way, would thus be many-propertied, which renders priority monism as qualitatively complex rather than simple. And then, on the other hand, sort of turning our attention to priority monism, what we have is the postulation of the existence of many fundamental entities, many mereological atoms, and which are, however, non-composite, but there are still many of them. And so what we have is, it's quite clear that there is a postulation of the fewest number and kinds of properties, because as I said before, these are tropes. And so these are, in a way, simple entities. There are zero properties within priority pluralism. Yet, as there needs to be a near infinite number of existing mereological atoms or tropes for the composition of the variety of actual material objects, there are thus many mereological atoms, which then renders priority pluralism as quantitatively complex, because there are many, many, many atoms that need to be postulated. And so it's quantitatively complex rather than quantitatively simple. And so these two explanations thus both fail to fulfill criterion 4, and thus together posit explanations that predict the data at hand and fit with our background knowledge, but nevertheless are complex postulations. And so what we can then do is compare our candidates, what we have in front of us. And so in regards to the occurrence of our explanatory target, the existence of the non-fundamental entities, we have three candidate fundamental explanations: theism, priority monism, and priority pluralism. Now, all of these explanations fit with our background knowledge and yield or predict the data to an extremely high level. However, what we find with two of these explanations, priority monism and priority pluralism, is that there is a postulation made concerning the fundamental entities, the cosmos or the collection of mereological atoms, that is complex and thus less simple than the postulation made by theism. That is, theism, as noted previously, postulates the existence of one fundamental entity, God. And this single fundamental entity is a metaphysically simple omnipotent trope, who is thus identical to each of the attributions made of him, and thus instantiates zero properties. Thus, theism, unlike priority pluralism, postulates the fewest number of entities, one. And unlike priority monism, it postulates the fewest kinds of entities, one. And it also postulates the fewest number and kinds of properties, zero. And so in comparison then to priority monism and priority pluralism, theism is a simpler explanation of our explanatory target. In other words, theism fulfills our inductive criteria to a greater extent than the alternative inanimate fundamental explanations. And thus, given this, we have a good reason to take these latter explanations, priority monism and pluralism, as solely being full rather than fundamental explanations that can serve as a terminus and explanation for the existence of the non-fundamental entities. More specifically, as was noted previously, if one can formulate an explanation that allows us to have a metaphysical explanation with a greater fulfillment of our inductive criteria, in this case, a simpler explanation than the existing options, without there also being a corresponding loss in the fulfillment of any of the other components of the criteria, such as fit with background knowledge or predictive power, then we have good reason to adopt that specific explanation as being the fundamental explanation for our explanatory target. And so theism, in comparison to priority monism and pluralism, is in fact the simplest explanation, fitting with our background knowledge that leads us to expect the existence of the non-fundamental entities that are part of the layered structure of reality. And so theism is something which can serve as the terminus of explanation. But this doesn't mean that we need to do away with priority monism or pluralism, as in fact the central thesis that we find within these frameworks, the fact that for priority monism, that the whole is prior to its part, and thus metaphysical explanation dangles down from the whole to its parts. We can take theism to be part of this framework, because theism postulates the existence of a single fundamental entity, God, who, if priority monism is true, then grounds the cosmos, and thus explanation dangles downwards from him through the cosmos to everything else. Or if we take priority pluralism to be true, God is the sole fundamental entity who grounds a collection of the mereological atoms, and thus explanation snakes upwards from him through the mereological atoms to everything else. And so given this, within the scientific or categorical layered view of reality that we sort of detailed previously, we can take this to be the truth of the matter. It can be so that these things are layered in this specific way. But what we need to see here is that, in fact, of stopping at the physics category, which will include either priority monism or pluralism, we need to descend further down and stop within the theology category. And so this descent will be seen then as one that takes God to be the absolute fundamental entity, and then everything above it. And so if we are looking at the image to the left of the screen, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and economics are all less fundamental than theology, than the entity that resides within that specific category. And so what we then see by descending to the theology category, we reach our terminus in explanation for the existence of the non-fundamental entities. That is God. The entity studied by theology is the sole fundamental entity within the layered structure of reality, because he is not the output of any grounding relation. Nothing presses upwards on God. Rather, he presses upwards on all other non-fundamental entities. And so God acts as the fundamental source of all of reality. His existence is sufficient for the existence of all the other non-fundamental entities existing at any given time. And so what we have then is the fact that the layered structure of reality terminates in God and God alone. He can serve as our fundamental explanation for everything else that exists in a non-fundamental way. Thank you very much. And I thank you so much for listening to my talk. Hopefully it was clear and hopefully people enjoyed it. And thank you so much. And I look forward to reading and hearing some of your questions. Thank you very much. Take care.